The U.S. government drafts a plan for nuclear war that reveals a hidden agenda in the war against communism. I discussed this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels. Today it is Short Story Tuesday, so I wanted to talk about an interesting short story that I found. And today's short story is all about nuclear war. I am referring to Southside by Jack D. Forbes, which was published in 1995 in his short story collection, Only Approved Indians. For those who don't know, Jack D. Forbes was an indigenous American writer who wrote between the 1930s he lived between the 1930s and 2011. He was mostly a historian writing about Native history, issues pertaining to indigenous Americans. He was also an activist. I think he was somewhat involved in the takeover of Alcatraz Island in the 1960s, 1970s. And he wrote a couple of short story collections and a few books here and there, and he won a number of awards for his work as well. Pretty interesting author. I actually found this at my local library. Don't forget to patronize your local libraries. They might have interesting short story collections from indigenous writers that you never knew existed. And the writing in here is pretty fascinating, and I'll talk a bit more about that in the analysis section. Without further ado, let's talk about Southside. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Southside focuses on Bill Grimes. He was a professor at one time, but he was recruited into the defense covert operations industry, like the CIA and other such groups. And so he's essentially a spy operative. And at the beginning of the story, we find that he's been assigned to the Southside operation. Which the exact nature isn't really clear, but we find out details as the story progresses. He is assigned a book that he has to read. He has to read through it, and then he has to expose it to sunlight to destroy it. But it talks about the South operation, basically detailing what's going to happen in a potential World War III as predicted by the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, and other such industries. And the people who wrote it are concerned that not enough white Christians will survive. Many people are going to be relocated to South America and the Southern Hemisphere, as the estimates suggest that the people in those regions will survive a nuclear war. The hope is that white Christendom will survive any war that comes as a result. And in fact, Bill's family is moved to Argentina, but Bill is moved to the South operation in Antarctica, which is tasked with just monitoring nuclear wars and targeting them towards communist nations in the event that World War III happens, and also preparing for an inevitable World War IV, at least as predicted by the government there. And in fact, World War III does break out. Nuclear weapons are deployed. Bill loses contact with the outside world and is only able to really talk to other government stations in Antarctica, but eventually they have to stop using fuel for these operations, and everyone just kind of goes dark, and that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, this is a pretty bleak story, but I do think it kind of outlines some things that a lot of people have noted about the United States for quite some time. One of the main themes that Forbes is working with is that of the hidden agenda. What he is suggesting here is that this fight between capitalism and communism, between like United States, Western nations, and Russia and China and North Korea and other such nations. What it actually is it's a white supremacist fight. It's a fight between what the United States perceives as Western white ideals and other powers that aren't necessarily what they would classify as white. Chinese individuals, communist ideals, like collectivist ideals, more so than anything else. And so the United States, what Bill is reading here, is the United States plan, or the defense industry's plan, the corporate elites, to basically establish a place for white Christians to survive after a nuclear war. And Bill kind of takes pleasure in knowing this, knowing that he's been a Mormon missionary before, so he's familiar with this sort of colonialist kind of ideology of establishing, a colonialist foothold in these southern nations in order to allow white Christendom to survive there. And there's an interesting quote that I would like to read to you from this. He felt that at long last his training in political science and public administration would be put to good use as an important part of the struggle to preserve Christian civilization, which is a very interesting quote, because usually those public servants say they're doing it for they're working in the government for the good of Americans. But here you see, like, they're saying the quiet part out loud, which is they're not actually trying to do that. They're just trying to preserve the white Christian way of life. Missionaries especially want to spread, the white Christian way of life to people they deem inferior or savage, and that's really how the southern hemisphere is viewed according to the Western powers. So it's a very sort of dark take and a dark view, and what you can really argue here is that America has never really been subtle about this, especially in their support of apartheid for a little bit in South Africa, the way they view Gazans in the current Gazan genocide, and a variety of other nations, especially like the overthrow of communist regimes in South America, and the overthrow and support of warlords and other such people in African nations. America has never really been exactly subtle about this. So you could argue that Forbes is actually making a very interesting point in his sort of reveal of this white supremacist sort of plan that is being enacted for a future war. And you could also say that this might be the same thing that might be on the agenda for climate change, rather than trying to save these nations that are viewed as savage or something like that. They're just going to invest all the resources in America and try to preserve that way of life, and just let the other nations, die. And maybe when the problem is fixed, they can, go and colonize those nations again. Basically investing resources in the white Christian way of life to preserve that for as long as possible, even if that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is going to thrive. Some people are viewed as expendable here. And ultimately, this comes off as like a raging conspiracy theory. A couple of the short stories in this collection have that sort of tone, where it's being extremely critical of the government in a way that comes off as a conspiracy theory. But if there's someone I would trust to, understand how the United States treats those it views inferior, it's someone who is an indigenous American, like Jack Forbes. Like, this is probably exactly the case, exactly what the defense industry, the Pentagon, and other such organizations have planned in order to preserve this corporate capitalist white Christian way of life. And saying that it's not doing so is kind of naive, because that's how it's been historically. And why would they be any different in drafting other such plans if America was kind of founded on this sort of Christian, maybe racist ideology? Another interesting aspect of this story is the thought of like theory versus execution. The government has drafted a detailed plan for preservation. It's like we're all going to move everyone to the southern hemisphere when it comes time, and that's how we're going to basically ride out this nuclear devastation. But the execution of it throws the idea of success into question, because everyone, like, they lose contact with the outside world. Now, is that happening because the communication lines have been thrown off, and it's no longer possible to reach out to South America? Or did the Eastern powers, the communist powers, foresee that this is exactly what the West was going to try to do, and they just bombed the Southern Hemisphere too? Or is it the case that this is all just one world, and that assuming that you could prevent the destruction of all of it by moving to the Southern Hemisphere is kind of naive and a little bit stupid? I think that might be the case. What Forbes might be arguing is that if you destroy any part of the world, no survival is really possible. That you can't just, move everyone to one part of the world and hope that the problem goes away, or that your kind of people, your way of life will survive, because, again, this is just one world. And, weather patterns, and among many other things, can be unpredictable, and you can't sort of plan your way out of disaster. And that maybe this white supremacist ideology is going to get everyone killed regardless. That if you're planning for complete destruction and annihilation, that's exactly what you're going to get. So the execution results in a very sad, possibly tragic, complete annihilation of humanity. And Bill is kind of interesting in this story because he doesn't really feel like a fully fleshed out character, more of a stand-in for people who kind of support this way of life. It's interesting because Bill just seems like a pawn. Like, yes, his family has moved to South America, but Bill ends up stuck in Antarctica at the South Pole. Like, he's not going to get out, and he's most likely going to die. No one's coming to save him because the powers that be, the corporate America and the defense industry, they always viewed Bill as someone who was expendable, as someone who could be manipulated in this way to facilitate the destruction or help in the planning of this complete annihilation. And you wouldn't have to really reward him with anything but maybe helping out his family. And who knows how his family ended up. But I think it's interesting that Bill is kind of a pawn, and there are many people like Bill in the actual world who don't realize they're being used as pawns in this way. So ultimately, this is a really good story. I do think that it could be fleshed out a little bit more. I think there are a couple short stories in this collection that feel like they're solid and like they're an interesting start, but there needs to be a little bit more for them to be completely visualized, or like what Jack Forbes' vision was met. Like that vision could be met a little bit more if these stories were fleshed out. This isn't bad, but like it'd be more interesting if there was like more around it, more characters around it, or something like that. And I could possibly see this being an incredible novel if Jack Forbes was to, or had at the time, because unfortunately he's dead. But like if he had like kind of again fleshed it out in that sort of way, you could have a lot more, and you could possibly say a lot more about this sort of white supremacist sort of endeavor, but also say a lot about the government and how it's facilitating all this, even while saying I support equality or whatever it's trying to say. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Southside. Pretty interesting short story. One, again, it does sort of have a conspiracy theory kind of vibe to it. This entire short story collection kind of has that vibe to it. But again, like you're not really saying anything that's not true. I feel like you're calling out America for being this white supremacist organization, and that's exactly what it can be and has been and continues to be and to this day. So, Forbes is kind of acknowledging a grand problem, and how, the defense industry isn't really out for protecting everyone. It's out for protecting a very certain subclass of people. No one is coming to save us, as the frequent mantra seems to be said. But yeah, if you have any thoughts on this, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you and have a discussion about this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that other people can find out about this author or this book or the short story if they don't already know. And other than that, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and hopefully non-nuclear travels. Farewell.